I'm Spencer Bailey. This is Time Sensitive. Hey everyone, on this week's episode, I'm joined in the studio by the Brooklyn-based artist Adam Pendleton. Widely known for his paintings that rigorously combine spray painting, stenciled geometric forms, and brushstrokes, Adam is guided in part by a conceptual and theoretical framework he calls Black Dada, which, as you'll hear him get into on the episode, has no one fixed or set definition. Adam has previously described this philosophy as, quote, a way to talk about the future while talking about the past. It is our present moment. If this sounds heady, that's because it is. It's my hope that this episode highlights and explores some of the core aspects of Black Dada while, true to form, remaining open-ended. By total coincidence, we began recording this episode on April 8th at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, which coincided with the solar eclipse. So about 20 minutes in, we took a break to go take it in right at its peak time in New York City. From a time perspective, it really couldn't have been more perfect to witness this solar event with him. Many will recognize Adam's work from Who is Queen, his solo 2021 exhibition at New York's Museum of Modern Art, which he has said was his way of, quote, trying to overwhelm the museum. Overall, his work is overwhelming, and I mean that as a compliment. In his abstract paintings, films, and installations, there's a beautiful cacophony of things that coalesce to create heightened meaning and feeling. Adam is an artist who embraces ambiguity and being misunderstood. That's part of the point. At once political and spiritual, his radical works prod and encourage introspection and greater consideration, practically demanding viewers to look, and then look again. One thing that stands out to me from our conversation is when Adam spoke about how, with our screens always on and smartphones pinging, we rarely take time for deeper consideration these days, and how, in turn, that has led to a hurried, frenzied, and, well, less considerate culture overall. It may sound obvious, but I'll be thinking about this important point, the close link between taking time for consideration and later being considerate for a long time to come. We also discuss his latest Pace Gallery exhibition titled An Abstraction. It's his first at the gallery's New York space in a decade and will feature 12 paintings and 13 drawings hanging within a black triangular form architecture. Before we get into the episode, I'd first like to thank our Season 9 presenting sponsor, L'École, School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison Van Cleef and Arpels. With permanent campuses in Paris, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Dubai, as well as various traveling schools, L'École focuses on three primary areas: savoir-faire, the history of jewelry, and gemstones. Classes on subjects ranging from art history to introductory jewelry making are taught by a group of 60-some teachers, art historians, gemologists, jewelers, and artisans, all of them experts in their fields. Among L'École's newest offerings is the podcast Voice of Jewels. Through a combination of narration and insights from art historians, jewelry experts, and L'École lecturers, each episode delves into the stories and secrets behind history's most fascinating jewels. From Rihanna's grills to a necklace that once belonged to Louis XV's favorite mistress, to the legendary blue diamond. Available in both English and French, Voice of Jewels is narrated by the award-winning actor Edoardo Ballerini. Season 1, titled Sentimental Jewels, and Season 2, titled The Blue Diamond's 1001 Lives, are now available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can learn more about L'École and Voice of Jewels at www.l'ecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.LECOLEVANCLEEFARPELS.com. And now, here's my conversation with Adam. Hi, Adam. Welcome to Time Sensitive.
Hi, Spencer. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I'm going to start by saying that there is an eclipse happening in the middle of this interview. So I think we'll have to take a quick pause and go see the eclipse, this once in every 20-year type of event. But I thought I would start here actually with a broad question about time. And it's a question you've asked before. You once conducted an interview with the critic and poet Joan Ritalik. And it began with this question about time. And I thought it would be fun to ask you the same question.
Okay.
Which is, how has time changed the way you figure yourself in relation to your work?
Oh, I didn't ask her a simple question then, did I? Well, I think there are different ways to approach that question. And how would I answer that? My first reaction was actually to think about it in very practical terms of how much time do I have to dedicate or commit myself to certain aspects of my work, of my studio. Years ago, I did a show, I think it was around 2016, called Becoming Imperceptible, which was very much so about me disappearing, or an idea of me disappearing in relationship to my work. And I, almost a little shy of 10 years later, think that that has changed. And it's kind of, if I think about Becoming Imperceptible in relationship to a show and just the title of the show, Who is Queen, the show I did at MoMA, there's obviously this query into subjecthood and relationship to authorship and relationship to making and relationship to identity or identities, real or imagined, possible or impossible. I think I land in the gray, as in I want people to think of me in relationship to my work, but I also think that's a kind of an impossibility, because who or what are we at any given moment is influxed. It's not fixed. It's not stagnant. So I am mutable. We are mutable. Our conception or conceptions of ourselves or of each other are mutable and changing all the time.
I think most people also think of you immediately as this painter or filmmaker. Mm-hmm. But there's so much else to your practice that I wanted to get into that I think is key to understanding your work. And one component of that is your interviews, which this is sort of a selfish question as an interviewer, but you've published them in book form. You've also created these video portraits. Among others, you've interviewed the choreographer Ishmael Houston Jones, the artist Joan Jonas, the artist, writer, and critic Lorraine O'Grady, and the dancer, choreographer, and filmmaker Yvonne Rainer. How do you think of these conversations in the context of what you do overall, and how do you select and choose your subjects?
Painter, filmmaker, interviewer. I suppose, though, I think of myself primarily as a painter, albeit a painter who is preoccupied with how ideas exist in the world. And I think it is that preoccupation that leads me to operate slightly more discursively than the most traditional painter. So interested in engaging in dialogic spaces or creating dialogic spaces. And I think painting is a dialogic space. It's about dialogue and communicating and being responsive, seeking potential and identifying potential in the simplest gesture or mark. And that's also what a conversation is. So I have had and have people who I become very interested in or invested in speak speaking to, really. It's really that simple. I think that's also why I'm so invested in exhibition making, because they're also a way of creating space for conversation, for dialogue, for people to exist in relationship to each other, for ideas to exist in relationship to each other in terms of the encounter, but also in terms of an object or the objects and how they relate to each other. I think I often think of ideas as objects. In that way, let's say the work of Joan Jonas and the ideas that are embedded in it are objects that I like to look at and study, and having a conversation with her is a very, I would argue, efficient way to engage. But it's also mercurial. There's also this kind of strange alchemy that is at work, that is at play. And I'm curious about that. And the films, the portraits you mentioned, document those dialogues, those interactions, and those encounters. A lot of the portrait subjects, let's say someone like Ishmael or Jack Halberstam or Lorraine O'Grady, for example, have remarked at how different each portrait is. And I offer to them, when they have said that to me, is, well, each one of you are so different. So of course the films are different because I'm following your lead. And to go back to painting, that's something that interests me as a painter, is that even with these two hands, these same hands, every time I make a mark or a gesture, it's different. It's similar to being in conversation with someone. It's near impossible to have the same conversation twice, which I think is endlessly fascinating.
One more key aspect here is what you've described as poetic research, a term I love, but wanted to dig into a little bit. Could you share a bit about what poetic research looks like and what makes that research specifically poetic?
I think poetic research, if I had to quantify it, if I had to explicate, to put some language in relationship to it, it is research that is interested in the process rather than the outcome. It's, yes. Yeah, I know that.
It's sort of like this idea of, I think a lot of people research to an end, right? They conduct research because they're looking for something that is almost like an answer. Whereas you're looking for not necessarily an answer, but things that extend beyond. There's no final end to the research. It will endlessly go on.
It could potentially, yes, endlessly go on. And I think that's a part of the reason why, if you look at, again, the people who I have interviewed in a more official capacity for a publication or to make a video portrait, I'm often having conversations with those people in different forms or formats, because a part of what fascinates me is how the form or the format changes the interaction or the outcome. So yes, poetic research is invested in process and how process can relate or does relate to the end result, so to speak. But like you said, the results could be endless. You and I could talk all day, for example, right?
There was a reference I found in one of your books from Fred Moten where he talks about poetry as a mode of inquiry. Mm-hmm. I like that idea too, where it's about inquiry, and your research in an inverse way fulfills that exact same thing.
Yeah, that's wonderfully generative. Poetry as a mode of inquiry, indeed.
Reading and beyond that, bookmaking is sort of the other end of this work, another essential aspect. And all the titles of your books, they're source books really, have the word reader. And your books largely comprise, for those who aren't familiar with them, these sort of constellations, I would call them, of photocopied texts and other materials that clearly resonate with you. Reading them, or at least this was my experience, I was able to quite literally read between, beyond, into the lines of your work. For me, it was like another way of understanding paintings I'd already looked at before in a totally new way, a deeper way, and maybe a less surface level way. So I guess to turn this into a question, how do you view your reading in relation to your painting and to your filmmaking and to your installations?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what I'm reading affects the way I interact with and understand the world around me. It is a way of changing my understanding of the things that stimulate all of us. And that can be a smell or a texture or a taste or even a temperature. If your mind has a kind of different encyclopedic breadth to it than to if I never read anything, I can have a wider array of reactions to the things I encounter and stimulate me. I can have a different, I wouldn't say understanding, but I'm opening myself up to a wider set of possibilities, I would say, by diversifying and increasing the number of really input, how much information is stored in my mind, really, and how do I call on those things knowingly or unknowingly at different moments, at different times. Because it's not as though when we read something, I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't remember every word. I certainly have, depending on the text, will try to. I think about Baudrillard, this idea of like smooth traveling, right? Which is both about like the way in which we interact with things is superficial sometimes, but inevitably deep, because everything we interact with leaves a kind of an imprint or impression on us. And so I enter textural spaces to interact and again give myself a deeper variety of associations and possibilities.
It's sort of bookmaking as mark making, which is interesting.
That's a nice way to put it, yeah.
Many artists, I think it's worth noting, are weary of revealing their sources, or they at least often obscure them, and you're basically saying, here they are. You're indexing them for all to see. I looked at your books sort of as archives or library bookshelves in book form. Mm-hmm. They're like, here's what Adam looked at. Here's what he paid attention to. And the way you mix it up with this cut-up technique, too, it's like you're jumping shelves, but everything connects. Is that how you see it? I mean...
Well, you've touched on something, because I think I am interested in things that are indexical, right? Painting is indexical, at least in the way in which I approach it. So I'm making a library of marks, for example, in the same way one makes a library of books. And you pull from that library as one perceives it to be necessary or unnecessary, and you make something out of it. So yes, that is very much so how I go about the book making, at least when it comes to the readers. It is not a fast process. It's a very slow and decidedly deliberate. And a lot of the text you see in the readers, they are texts that I have spent years with typically. They're not
flippantly selected.
No, they're not one-night stands. These are deep and sustained relationships with often both the individual, but also the text itself. So they're really things that have to stay with me, almost like a flavor memory, the way the taste of something can trigger childhood, for example. That's kind of like how these texts function for me. They trigger something very deep and very meaningful for me, but also something I can't quite put my finger on. And I think that's also what fascinates me.
We'll return to a few of those texts you selected later in the interview. But for now, we have to go see an eclipse.
Okay,
So
sounds good.
We'll take a break and then come back.
Okay, great.
Hey everyone, taking a quick break here to tell you a little bit about our Season 9 presenting sponsor, L'École, School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison Van Cleef and Arpels. Since establishing its first 2 campuses in Paris and Hong Kong, L'École recently opened new campuses in Shanghai and Dubai as part of its aim to spread the knowledge of jewelry art and culture to as many people around the world as possible. These campuses offer free exhibitions and will eventually provide classes and in-person lectures by art historians, gemologists, jewelers, and craftspeople. Housed in the twin villas on Middle Huaihai Road and spread over nearly 22,000 square feet, the Shanghai School is the largest school of jewelry arts in the world. You can learn more about L'École and its current and upcoming offerings at www.l'ecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.LECOLEVANCLEEFARPELS.com. And now, back to the episode. All right, we're back from the eclipse.
Yes.
What'd you think?
I'm still processing. I thought, I mean, the most immediate thing is the kind of graphite color, right, that the eclipse created. It wasn't light or dark. It was this cool, sharp graphite-like color, which was pretty astonishing.
So I guess this brings me to the current moment. This year marks 15 years since you performed your Black Dada text.
Oh, wow.
And this was, for the listeners who aren't familiar with it, a poem-like script, I guess you could call it. And in it you declared, "History is an endless variation, a machine upon which we can project ourselves and our ideas. That is to say, it is our present moment." Black Dada is also this sort of theoretical framework that you've continuously engaged now for 15 years. And it's rooted in these 2 texts, Hugo Ball's Dada Manifesto from 1916 and Amiri Baraka's poem, Black Dada Nihilismus from 1964. So now that I've got all that out of the way, what has it been like for you to engage in this Black Dada framework for this period of time? And what's it been like to watch it evolve, shift, morph?
It doesn't feel like 15 years. Honestly, I still get nervous when people ask me what Black Dada is.
That's why I tried to define it.
Because my innate reaction is really, oh shit, what is it? To put it very simply, which is fascinating that, 15 years on, I don't have a packaged or concise response. And that's what makes it important to me, is that what it is something that I grapple with every time I encounter it as an artist, and also just when I encounter it as a question, as a query. What is it? And that's such an important part of my project, is figuring out what it is, both visually, what does it look like? And sometimes I reside in the space of thinking that Black Dada is solely a visual project. It's really trying to figure out what this looks like. And other times it is a more theoretical project where I'm trying to figure out what does it do, or what does it mean. And I think that's to say I call upon it in different ways. So it nourishes me in different ways at different moments. It's alive, for me, 15 years later, I think is, again, so wonderful about it. To hear that someone say that to me 15 years later,
Yeah.
What is something, is fascinating.
Yeah. From a time perspective of Black Dada, you've described it as about looking back at multiple things at once, many of them sort of simultaneous, which I love. I feel like that's sort of like to engage history and time in this way that is sort of destabilizing and that is never fixed. Could you elaborate a little bit on this, like your thoughts about the temporal nature of Black Dada?
Sure. Well, I think that Black Dada is a contrapuntal space. So it's many things happening at once. It is about the way in which things exist in relationship to each other. So a kind of series of radical juxtapositions, historical, aesthetic, theoretical. It's Amiri Baraka and Jean-Luc Godard. It's Joan Rotalick and Gertrude Stein. It's Popel and Joan Jonas. And, I could keep going, right? So it's in that way, too, about interpretation, how I interpret these ideas and why I read them as Black Dada, and why there's a kind of utility to that, me having that kind of understanding. I will say that I think a misunderstanding that exists around Black Dada. So Amiri Baraka, yes, the text, 1964, from Dead Lecturer, Hugo Ball, early 20th century, the Dada Manifesto. It is not a conflation of those two texts. It touches on Black Dada as a concept of ideas that circulate or are at work in those texts, but it exists without them as well. I would probably not go as far as to say that it would exist without the gift that Baraka offered me, right? Just putting those two words together, Black and Dada, that certainly spurred this entire project. Really just sort of the curiosity of why these two things, which he didn't really, I don't think he was thinking about it from, but I don't know, maybe he was from an art historical standpoint. He could have been thinking about it just in terms of noise or texture, just sort of simply, really, he just liked the way those two words existed in relationship to each other, or sounded in relationship to each other.
It's interesting you're saying that, because as you were describing this, I just kept thinking about music and what happens when sounds collide, and how through a certain sieve of sound, the way that those things are combined in a specific way by a specific person, you get something totally different than what the other person would do. Mm-hmm. So in a way, there is that to music.
Absolutely. And I think contrapunto usually is a musical term that I apply to visual and conceptual operations or spaces. I think time is contrapuntal, and I think the reality of how we experience and move through the world is a contrapuntal experience.
There's another 15-year anniversary this year, which is the residency you had at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in 2008, out of which you developed your system of display paintings. You've returned to that museum multiple times since. So I was wondering, looking back on it now, how you view this time and engagement with that particular museum and the time you had there as an artist in residence.
Wow, I didn't realize there would be so much reflection. It's funny what reflecting on certain moments, what they trigger. I remember when I was asked to do that residency, and I think there was a monetary component to it, and I remember, frankly, actually at that time, really needing the money as a very young artist. And the relationship I've had with the curator there, Pirana, has been so sustaining. And I think the way in which that institution engages with living artists is so unique, because it's not, do the residency and get out, or, even do the show and get out. I've done so many different kinds of things there. So I did the residency, which led to a body of work, which you accurately referenced, the system of display, which I continue to make to this day, 15 some years later, although they have changed radically over the years. And I was in a Joan Jonas performance reading Dante at the Gardner Museum. So I was a part of someone else's project at the museum. I did a show at the Gardner Museum years after the residency. I erected a banner on the facade of the museum. I did a public conversation with Lorraine O'Grady, one of our 3 or 4 proper meeting of the minds. One was at the Gardner Museum. So what a rich way for the museum to facilitate different possibilities. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about in relationship to museums and what they do, what they can do for artists. And of course, from a critical standpoint, what they don't do for artists. So it's really nice to think about that relationship, and the impact it has had on my work has been very deep, actually, when you prompt me with that question.
Yeah. Those are the only 15-year anniversaries I have, but there is a 10-year one,
Yes.
which is that this year marks, of course, the 10-year anniversary since you had your last gallery show,
Yes.
solo show at Pace
Yes.
Gallery here in New York.
Yeah.
How do you think about the time between that first show and this one, an abstraction that's about to open?
It will be just over 10 years because I think that my first show at Pace's Gallery in New York was April 2014, and this show will open in May 2024. So just a little over 10 years. And I was saying to Sam, the person who I work with at Pace, when we were looking at the work that will be included in the show, and I said to her, I couldn't have done these works 10 years ago, which is really interesting to think. And I'm sure it's a thought that occurs to a lot of artists all of the time, that you look at what you've just done and you think to yourself, oh, I couldn't have done that 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And the shows are radically different. This show is very much so about painting and abstraction and color and perception, the perception of color, the perception of space, of time, of experimentation, and how all of those things relate or possibly don't relate to painting, and all the things that painting can be and do. And I love how Amy Silman talks about painting as a kind of technology. I think is a very exciting way to kind of think about what is it. It's a specific technology. So my vocabulary has changed so much as an artist in that 10-year span. And I think I've distilled for this show the critical aspects or components of how my vocabulary, my visual vocabulary, has evolved. And vocabulary is an interesting terminology. And when I think about applying it as a painter, as a visual artist, and I was saying this to Arlene Checkett, artist friend of mine.
Who you had a show with?
Yes, who I recently did a show with in Madrid. It's like you develop these vocabularies, these visual vocabularies. You use them, but you also want to escape them. At least, you don't want to be like a hamster, or, you don't want to be on a repeat loop. Mm-hmm. You kind of want to always push past and move on. And so that's, in a strange way, what I'm doing when I'm painting. I'm always trying to push past or push beyond the last thing that...
But still somehow kind of circling back. I wouldn't say it's a full repetition, but it is this sort of back and forth.
Yes, there's an element of call and response. But I think to push past, I think people might think of like sweeping changes.
Yeah.
I am maybe speaking about it on a more molecular level, things that everyone might not notice.
I want to go back to painting as technology because I find that really interesting, and immediately my mind was going to like the cave paintings at Lascaux and thinking about painting as technology in that sense across time.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think if you specifically think about like early, right? Like it does often suggest a series of or set of future possibilities for the human imagination, for making, for images, for the way in which images are understood or interpreted or encountered. So it is something, as I perceive it or as I relate to it, that pushes past or pushes forward. And the history is cumbersome and problematic. And sometimes suffocating, but it can also be a liberating force as well.
Hey everyone, taking another quick break here to tell you a little bit about our weekly newsletter, where I share a behind-the-scenes look into each time-sensitive episode and also get into various things in the cultural sphere that I'm paying attention to at the moment. You can sign up and join our 11,000 other subscribers by going to slowdown.media/newsletter. That's slowdown.media/newsletter. And now, back to the episode. One more sort of news thing, I guess, happening at this moment is you're working on this big show, the Hirshhorn Museum, that's going to open next year. It's time to the Hirshhorn's 50th anniversary. What does it mean to you to be inhabiting that space on the National Mall? And how have you been thinking about that exhibition? Whatever you can share.
Well, it's an exhibition that will primarily focus of recent paintings and drawings. Some might come from the exhibition that's about to take place in New York. There is a aspect of the show that does touch on the National Mall, specifically Resurrection City, which was a kind of ad hoc protest camp or city that was erected on the mall in the 60s and is often considered or is considered the culmination of Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign. I'm always looking for visual prospects in unusual spaces. There were these triangular structures that were erected on the mall as a part of Resurrection City. They were dwellings, but there were also clinics or libraries. And a lot of the paintings that I've been working on also have these triangular forms. And before I started working on these paintings, I was looking at images of Resurrection City. And so now, with just a little bit of space to kind of think and reflect, I wonder if seeing those images of these triangular structures, dwellings, was the sort of point of origin of these triangular, things in the paintings. I don't know. But in any case, I think, the Hirshhorn is when we think about art and culture and the National Museum of Modern Contemporary Art, I think that's very meaningful and exciting. What is our National Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art? And I think the Hirshhorn has done an extraordinary job of being on the forefront of modern and contemporary art.
It's its own sort of profound geometry on the mall too.
It certainly is, yeah. And it's having to deal with that architecture is also interesting because I think since, say, the show at MoMA and the show that I did at MUMAC in Vienna and the architecture people will encounter for the show at Pace, I think it has become clear to me, and I'm sure to people who have seen the last several shows that I've done in museums in particular, know how important the architecture is for me, but even more than that, exhibition as form. So if painting is form, drawing is form, sculpture is form, now let's think about exhibition as form as well.
Yeah, there's something about the collective when you put together it all within this architecture, this space. It's almost, maybe it's a bit hyperbolic to describe it as sacred space, but it is a form of that. There's something that profoundly happens in alchemy, maybe is a good word here, where when you're in that space, you feel something different than when you're just looking at one painting?
I've realized increasingly how uninterested I am to just put, 10 of the most recent things on the wall. I want the space that I create for the 10 most recent things to be as meaningful as the 10 most recent things. So there's a kind of I'm expanding the potential of the space, and in that way expanding the potential of the thought.
Let's go back to your childhood home here, to go back deeper into memory.
Okay.
in Richmond, Virginia. You've previously mentioned your school teacher mother wanted to be a writer. She had all these books all over the house. And your father, who was a contractor, is also a musician, I understand. So you grew up around poetry, literature, music, all these encounters. And you started writing poetry at a young age, plays also. I guess paint a picture for this environment a little bit. It sounds like your parents really instilled a sense of creativity, or at least gave you space for that creativity to unfold.
Sure, absolutely. I'm sure there were people grew up in homes where there was no poetry, there was no music. I grew up, I would go from listening to Joni Mitchell to Miles Davis to Pat Metheny to, Tracy Chapman's most recent album. So an array of musical taste to, reading all kinds of books, Adrienne Rich, Audre Lorde. So, and that at a young age, not like when I was, say, 18, but really when I was maybe 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. It's amazing what imprints on your mind, like Adrienne Rich's 21 Love Poems, Rain on the West Side Highway, Red Light at Riverside. And I remember that particular text because it conjured an idea of New York for me, up the West Side Highway, red light at Riverside. I think it's across the city from you, I am with you, or something like this.
It's funny, you hear people talk about the formative books in their lives, but like this one, like to me, hearing you describe this, it's formative beyond just the word formative. I mean, it is like ingraining this form in your mind in a way. Yeah.
It was about a way of life. And I think art is a way of life. It's always been a way of being in the world, a way that I make sense of the world and interact with it. And I dedicated myself to art as a way of being at a very young age.
We have to bring this up. I mean, you graduated from high school at age 16. You go to study art through a 2-year independent study program in Pietrasanta, Italy, and then moved to New York at age 18 to become an artist. And just 3 years later, you're 21 and get your first solo show at a gallery. I mean, this is remarkable. Does not typically happen. But looking back, I guess, how do you think about that period of time from age 16 to 21? Those years?
I commend my parents, because if I had a child who sort of laid this out to me, I would say, no. Bad plan. So I have to commend my parents for being supportive, encouraging, and also for encouraging me to take risk. I don't have more to say than that.
Tell me about this time in Pietrasanta, though. Yeah. I think for those who aren't familiar, this is the land of Michelangelo.
Yes,
this
right.
is stone country.
It is, yes.
Carrara.
Marble, yes, yes. I had a series of great teachers during my very formative years. And the teacher that I had, Kyle Smith and Pietrasandra, you can call yourself anything, but it's always so much more meaningful, I think, at a certain point in your life when someone else calls you it. So if I called myself an artist, let's say when I was, 15 or 16, that was one thing. But when someone else says to you, you're an artist, that means something else. And that's what she said to me. She said, you're an artist. And I think mentally that just opened so many doors for me and understanding what I could do and what was possible.
Did you work in stone when you were there?
I did. I worked in stone. And so when she said to me, you're an artist, she basically said, you're an artist, but you should not be working in stone.
Well, I mean, there's obviously so many places we could go with this conversation, but I thought I would take this next moment to sort of do what you do in your books, which is this cut-up technique, and kind of turn it into a cut-up session where I reference some of the references that have been key for you. So there's 3 of them here that are these photocopied texts from your books, and one of them is a 2013 essay, Occupy Time, by Jason Adams, and it looks at the Occupy movement through the lens of time and space. There's a quote I wanted to read that really, even though it was written 11 years ago, still really hits me. Today, the experience of time has become greatly accelerated, much more so even than just 1 decade ago. Whether or not one has access to the social media sites or smartphones that are increasingly turning the old spatially defined continents into new temporally defined telecontinents. Trillions of dollars in financial transactions still speed around the globe daily. He adds, this ever-increasing speed of realization is a primary basis of contemporary capitalism. Hearing it now, what does that bring up for you? Aside from the fact that we live in a super sped up capitalist society.
So that was 10 years ago. So it's nerve-wracking, I think might be the best way to put it, to think that things are even more sped up. We have less time for reflection and being considered and considerate. I think that first part is really key. Considering each other and where you might be coming from or where I might be coming from as individuals, but also even on a geopolitical level, spatially. I think that's maybe the real Cassandra, so to speak, is do we have time to consider each other and to be considered? And I think that's increasingly getting lost. To put an optimistic spin on it, I think
it is a dark time.
I do think, this is tried and true, but when one thing is lost, something else is gained. So,
and I do think that idea of making time to consider and then in turn to be considerate, I think the considerate part comes from the considering. You take time to wrestle with contradiction or boredom or whatever it is you're dealing with, and you oftentimes will come out on the other side a more considerate person. That is the reality. But if we have something pinging in our pockets every 5 minutes, or it's much harder to find time for that consideration.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that I ask myself often. Do I have the ability to work outside of distraction? like even in this moment, like while I'm talking to you, I'm stimulating myself with picking out different titles.
We're surrounded by books.
Yes, different the distracted mind it's one state of being, and so it's sort of like sometimes I do these kind of quasi junk science experiments where it's sort of paint with music versus paint without music, or I have an idea for something that I want to paint or a medium I want to use. Like over the weekend, I became very preoccupied with wanting to do certain things with or in watercolor. This was like Saturday, and I said, okay, I'm going to do that tomorrow on Sunday. And then I didn't do it on Sunday. I did it briefly today before coming here. And then I always, maybe you do this as well, but I thought to myself, I wonder how much this changed what I did by not doing it on Saturday when I immediately had the idea, and didn't do it on Sunday but waited until I'm always wondering, well, what would have happened? Time shapes all things, one says. But,
the strokes,
but how?
The stroke's different on Saturday than it would be on Sunday. Just like, if I sit down to write a sentence, it's going to be different on Saturday than it is on Monday.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wow, fascinating. Okay, next one. Another of your references I wanted to quote from is Toni Cade Bambara's "What It Is I Think I'm Doing Anyhow." She writes, "I'm attempting to blueprint for myself a merger of these two camps, the political and the spiritual. The possibilities of healing that split are exciting. The implications of actually yoking these energies and of fusing that power quite take my breath away." I have to say, when I read that, I just thought that that's the experience I have looking at your paintings. And of everything I read in your readers, this particular text really stood out to me.
Yeah, that's pretty darn good. It's hard to respond to, frankly. What it is I think I'm doing anyhow, I think it kind of says everything. Just the title of the piece.
All right, the third one is in Adrienne Edwards' essay, Some Thoughts on a Constellation of Things Seen and Felt from 2020. She writes about, quote, our overwhelming visuality. And we were just talking about, the bombardment of devices, smartphones, just the noise. But I guess I wanted to ask, in your own work, how do you grapple, contend with this overwhelming visuality that she writes about?
I think she's speaking about it in a kind of social, societal space or realities. I am creating visual spaces that occasionally overwhelm. One of the ways that I deal with it as an artist is I return to visual spaces and create different relationships between them. So to put it more plainly, I paint in layers, and often these layers are photographed. And because they're photographed, I can often do create different relationships between these layers. So I might have layer A, B, C, and D, and at first I put A and D together, and then one day I'll put C and D together, and something else emerges. So I deal with or contend with this overwhelming visuality, this overwhelming visual experience that I arguably am creating by many returns. I go back and back and back again to move forward.
To finish, I thought we'd end on the subject of jazz.
Mm-hmm.
Your books reference and or include interviews with a number of jazz musicians, Charles Mingus, Cecil Taylor, Anthony Braxton, Ornette Coleman. And I also read somewhere that your favorite Toni Morrison book is jazz.
Mm-hmm.
Improvisation, repetition. We've already talked a bit about repetition, and also this idea of the cut. These are all themes in jazz. They're also things I sense in your work. And I was wondering if you could speak to this, the power of jazz, and how you see it manifest or live in your work.
I wish I could speak to the power of jazz, but I think jazz, like Black Dada, is when someone poses that question to me, to what is jazz, I begin to stutter and fall silent because I don't want to quantify what it is or how I exist within it or in relationship to it. I'm driven by curiosity. I'm driven not by what I know, but what I don't know. And I don't know what jazz is. I don't know what Black Dada is. And that's what drives me.
Beautiful. I thought we'd end on a quote from the great Ismail Reed, which, yes, I also pulled from one of your books. And it's, "Time is a pendulum, not a river, more akin to what goes around comes around."
Nice.
Adam, thank you. This is a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. I enjoyed this very much. Thank you.
Extra thanks to our Season 9 presenting sponsor, L'École, School of Jewelry Arts, which is supported by the Maison Van Cleef and Arpels. A unique place for learning, L'École welcomes the general public to the world of jewelry through courses, talks, exhibitions, videos, books, and now, its Voice of Jewels podcast. You can find out more about L'École at www.l'ecolevancleefarpels.com. That's www.LECOLEVANCLEEFARPELS.com. And thank you for listening. You can find more episodes of Time Sensitive on our website, timesensitive.fm, or wherever you listen to podcasts. To keep up with our latest time-sensitive episodes and get behind-the-scenes updates, sign up for our newsletter at slowdown.media/newsletter. That's slowdown.media/newsletter. You can follow us on Instagram at slowdown.media. Our theme music was composed by Billy Martin. This episode was produced by Ramon Broza, Emily Jang, Mimi Hannon, Emily McDonald, and Johnny Sen.